Mia Langley had never been the kind of person who sought conflict. She loved quiet order, symmetry, and the kind of beauty that could only come from patience. As a landscape designer, she believed every space could be tamed and balanced if one simply listened to it long enough. That was what she had hoped for when she moved into her late uncle's house, a modest, weathered property on the edge of a once rural neighborhood that had slowly been consumed by the sprawl of a gated community and its ever-watchful homeowners association. The house had stood there for nearly 40 years, its cedar walls faded to a silvery gray, surrounded by towering oaks that whispered in the wind like old confidants. For Mia, it wasn't just an inheritance, it was a sanctuary. Her uncle had always told her that the property line ended where the forest began, and that beyond it, the land belonged only to the wild. When she unpacked the last of her boxes and stood on the back deck, she could almost feel his presence lingering in the quiet air. There was a peace to the place that she hadn't known in years, the kind that couldn't be bought or designed, a peace that came from space, distance, and the faint hum of insects instead of traffic. She'd been through a difficult breakup only months before, and the solitude here felt restorative. Her plan was simple, to build a small studio near the edge of the lot, a place where she could work on client sketches during the day and paint when inspiration came at night. The idea of creating something with her own hands on her own land filled her with determination and calm. She thought it would be easy, file a few permits, clear a few shrubs, maybe deal with a couple of curious neighbors. She was wrong. The first sign of trouble came before she had even broken ground. As she marked out the corners of the planned studio with thin stakes and bright orange twine, she noticed a man watching her from the property next door. He stood perfectly still behind a trimmed hedge, a clipboard in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the other. His posture was too deliberate to be casual. When their eyes met, he lifted the glass in greeting, but the smile that followed was thin and cold. "Morning," he called across the yard, his tone too polished to sound friendly. "That looks like quite the project." Mia smiled politely, brushing soil from her hands. "Just a small studio. It's well within my line." The man stepped closer, adjusting his tie, though the day was too warm for one. "I'm John West. I head the HOA board. We like to keep an eye on new developments. Sometimes boundaries get blurred." He let the last word hang in the air with quiet weight before nodding and walking away. Mia felt an unease she couldn't name. She hadn't joined the HOA. Her uncle's property had never been part of it, and yet the way John spoke made it sound like she owed him an explanation. That night she dug through her uncle's old documents until she found the deed and survey papers. The thick yellowed pages confirmed what she already knew. Her land sat just outside the HOA's jurisdiction by nearly 20 feet. Still, something in John's tone had carried the kind of confidence that came from habit, the certainty of someone used to winning small battles through persistence. The next morning, as the sun spread over the dew-covered grass, Mia heard the distant hum of a car engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. A white SUV with county markings pulled up at the front gate. Two men stepped out, one holding a clipboard, the other a camera. They introduced themselves as code enforcement officers responding to a report of unpermitted construction. The words stung like static in the air. Mia blinked in disbelief before inviting them in. She showed them the plans, the property maps, the city-approved pre-authorization for her studio. The officers, polite but clearly embarrassed, glanced at each other and quickly realized there was no violation. One even apologized before leaving, promising to note the mistake. When the SUV disappeared down the road, Mia stood motionless for a long time, the apology echoing in her mind. A mistake? Or a warning? She looked toward the hedge separating her property from John West's and saw the faint shimmer of sunlight off a window. Someone was watching. She could feel it. That evening she poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, trying to brush off the tension. Maybe it was just bureaucracy gone wrong. Maybe the HOA had flagged her project by accident. Yet deep down, she knew it wasn't an accident. The first letter from the HOA arrived 2 days later, printed on thick paper with embossed lettering that reeked of quiet authority. Notice of concern, it read. Your recent activities appear to extend beyond your property boundary. Please cease construction until clarification is provided. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. John West, President. Mia folded the letter carefully, her hands trembling only slightly, and looked out toward the tree line. The forest rustled as if it knew something she didn't. For the first time since moving in, the serenity she'd cherished felt fragile, like glass about to crack. She reminded herself that she had proof, that she was right, and yet an uneasy thought crept into her mind. People like John didn't send letters. They sent warnings wrapped in politeness, and warnings, she realized, were never just words. It started on a Tuesday morning, gray and cold, when the second code enforcement vehicle rolled up in front of Mia's driveway. She was still half asleep, wearing her uncle's old flannel shirt, and holding a mug of coffee when she saw the two men stepping out of the van. Their expressions carried that same awkward mixture of authority and apology she'd come to recognize in bureaucrats who didn't want to be there. One of them asked her name, and when she confirmed it, he unfolded a printed complaint form. Someone, he explained, had reported her for unauthorized grading and structural excavation on residential property. Mia nearly laughed at the absurdity. Her so-called construction site was nothing more than a few stakes, a garden shovel, and a stack of potted plants she hadn't had time to move. She tried to keep her tone steady as she explained everything, showing them the pre-approval documents again. The men exchanged glances, apologized, and left, saying they would mark it as resolved. But their presence lingered like a ghost in the air, another reminder that someone was watching, someone with the power to summon the machinery of the county with a single phone call. The first time it had felt like an error. This time it felt deliberate. Mia tried to shake it off, diving into her work to distract herself. But that night, when she took out her trash, she found a yellow notice taped to her mailbox, citing her for improper waste containment. The fine was absurdly high, $500 for leaving bins visible from the road, a rule that didn't even apply outside HOA boundaries. She stood in the dark with the paper fluttering in her hand, her pulse quickening. She looked toward John West's property. His windows were lit, curtains open just enough for her to see the flicker of a television. She wondered if he was sitting there watching her read it, waiting for her reaction. By the end of the week, 2 more inspections followed. One officer complained about the height of unapproved fencing. Another cited vegetation encroachment beyond permitted line. Each time, Mia produced documentation, and each time the officials apologized before leaving. It became a pattern: anonymous complaints, official visits, embarrassed apologies, and a rising sense of intrusion. By the 6th visit, she stopped bothering with politeness. She demanded the name of the person filing the complaints, but the inspectors always gave the same answer: it's confidential. Still, one younger inspector, clearly sympathetic, let something slip as he packed his camera. "Ma'am," he said softly, "off the record, it's the HOA president. He's filed half the reports in this zip code this month." That night Mia couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her flinch: the rustle of leaves, the far-off hum of a car, the lonely bark of a dog. Around midnight she caught a faint light moving through the trees behind her property, like the slow drift of a flashlight beam. She turned off her porch light and watched. The light hovered near her fence line, paused, then disappeared. When she checked in the morning, she found faint boot prints pressed into the damp soil. The pattern continued for weeks, 12 visits in total. Each time a different officer, each time the same apologetic tone. The last one arrived on a Sunday, when Mia was watering her plants. He was older, polite, and visibly uncomfortable, as though he knew how absurd it was to disturb someone over a garden hose. "Look," he told her quietly, "I'm sorry, but we have to respond to every report, even when they're clearly nonsense. Honestly, between you and me, I think someone's trying to wear you down." His words felt like confirmation of what she already knew, but didn't want to admit. The next day, she decided to take control. She drove downtown to the county records office and requested every document she could find related to her property line. The clerk, an elderly woman with kind eyes, spent nearly an hour searching through microfilm and digital archives before printing out the official maps. The results were unambiguous. Mia's land stopped exactly where she believed it did, 21 feet short of the HOA's jurisdiction. There was no overlap, no confusion, no legal gray area. Her uncle had even renewed the boundary survey just 3 years before his death. She had been right all along. Driving home with the folder beside her, Mia felt a surge of defiance. The fear that had been building inside her was slowly hardening into anger. She wasn't going to let John West intimidate her out of her own land. But when she pulled into the driveway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her garden stakes, the ones marking the edges of her planned studio, had been pulled up and laid neatly across the driveway, forming an X. It wasn't random vandalism. It was a message. She called the sheriff's department, but the deputy who arrived seemed uninterested. "Could be kids," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "We don't have cameras or witnesses, so there's not much we can do." Mia showed him the tire tracks near the gate, fresh ones, smaller than her truck's. He promised to file a report, but didn't write anything down. When he left, she stood at the window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Her reflection in the glass looked foreign, tight-lipped, wary, no longer the woman who'd moved here seeking peace. That evening, a new letter appeared on her doorstep, folded into a plastic sleeve. "Final warning," it read. "Failure to comply with HOA standards may result in civil enforcement." She laughed bitterly. "I'm not even in your damn HOA," she whispered, but the laughter caught in her throat. Beneath the printed warning was a handwritten note in neat cursive. "You'll regret ignoring community regulations." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. Over the next days, she began to feel as though the entire neighborhood had turned against her. When she walked her dog along the road, some neighbors looked away. Others gave tight, uncomfortable smiles. One woman, pruning her roses, muttered loud enough for Mia to hear, "Some people think the rules don't apply to them." The air of hostility grew thicker, more organized, like an invisible net closing in. Even deliveries became tense. A courier once told her he'd been stopped at the HOA gate and questioned about why he was bringing supplies to a disputed property. It reached a breaking point when, late one evening, a code enforcement truck idled outside her gate for nearly an hour without approaching. The headlights stayed on, engine running, as if whoever was inside wanted her to know they were there. Mia stood inside the house, every light off, watching the glow through the blinds. It didn't move until just before dawn. When she finally stepped outside, she found deep tire grooves in the mud, evidence of the silent siege she couldn't prove. The next morning, she walked her property line with the survey map in hand. The dew sparkled under the pale light, and the air was still, but she felt watched. Every step brought her closer to the truth that was both vindicating and terrifying. She was right, and that made her dangerous to someone who couldn't stand being wrong. When she reached the far corner near the forest, she found a small metal stake driven into the ground that hadn't been there before. It bore a tiny plastic tag with the HOA logo. Someone had crossed onto her land and tried to move the boundary by hand. That was the moment the fear finally gave way to fury. Mia tore the stake out of the ground and hurled it into the woods. The sound echoed like a shot in the silence. She stood there for a long time, trembling, the morning wind threading through her hair, her breath visible in the cold air. They could send their inspectors and their warnings and their fake authority, but she wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. She knew the truth, and truth, she thought, could cut deeper than any threat. The morning after the 12th visit, Mia sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers, Maps, letters, and photographs, the clutter of proof that had begun to swallow her once orderly home. The sun struggled through the clouds outside, throwing weak light across the documents spread before her. Her coffee had gone cold, forgotten long ago, as she pored over every inch of her property's survey records, trying to understand how something so clear could be twisted against her. The more she studied them, the more absurd the situation became. The boundaries were fixed and indisputable. Her land was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Her uncle had even fought a minor zoning dispute years ago to ensure that the association couldn't claim oversight. Yet here she was, treated like a trespasser on her own soil. The thought made her chest tighten. She realized that she was no longer dealing with confusion or incompetence. This was strategy, a slow, deliberate pressure campaign meant to break her resolve. Mia decided she couldn't fight it alone anymore. That afternoon, she drove into town and found a small law office tucked between a bakery and a thrift store. The attorney, a woman in her 40s named Laura Park, listened quietly as Mia told her story. Laura's calm, analytical demeanor contrasted with Mia's frustration, but her eyes grew sharper as the details unfolded. "They've got no standing," Laura said finally. "Your property isn't within their jurisdiction, and code enforcement shouldn't be responding to HOA complaints that don't apply to your parcel. If they are, someone's pushing the limits of the system." She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notepad. "I've seen this before. An association trying to absorb an independent lot through intimidation, hoping the owner either sells or folds. But the key will be evidence. Keep everything. Every letter, every visit, every voicemail." That night, Mia installed 2 new security cameras, one facing the road, another covering the backfield near the forest. The installation felt less like protection and more like defiance, as if she were finally drawing her own line in the sand. As she worked, she noticed the flicker of movement near the fence, the silhouette of someone standing just beyond the tree line. She froze, gripping the screwdriver in her hand like a weapon. The figure lingered for a few seconds before turning away, melting into the dark. She called out, but her voice fell flat against the still night. By the time she reached the fence, there was nothing but footprints in the dirt. Heavy boots, too large to be anyone from the nearby houses. She recorded everything, snapping photos under the weak beam of her flashlight. The following morning, she took the evidence to Laura, who frowned as she flipped through the images. "He's testing you," the lawyer said. "They always start with little intrusions. A complaint here, a visit there, then they cross the physical boundary. You have to document every instance. And if anyone comes on your land again, call the sheriff. Don't ask. Demand a report number." Laura's tone carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen such games escalate before, and it both comforted and unnerved Mia. For the next week, she followed the lawyer's advice, keeping a written log of everything that happened. There was no rest. The pattern changed, growing more personal. The trash bins she kept by the garage were overturned in the night, their contents scattered across the gravel. One morning, she found her mailbox hanging open, the flag torn off, and the hinges bent. At first she thought it might be kids, but then she saw the faint outline of tire marks leading away from the gate, same small tread pattern as before. She began to wake up before dawn just to check the perimeter, flashlight in hand, the silence of the woods pressing against her nerves. It was during one of these early walks that she noticed something strange. Near the northwest corner of her property, where the trees grew dense and the ground sloped down toward the creek, she found a freshly painted wooden post hammered into the soil. Attached to it was a laminated tag reading, "Survey marker, community boundary, do not remove." The words, "community boundary," made her throat tighten. It hadn't been there a week ago, and it sat well within her land. She crouched beside it, tracing her fingers over the crisp white surface. The paint was new, the ground around it disturbed. Someone had deliberately shifted the physical markers. When she showed the photos to Laura, the lawyer's expression darkened. "This is serious," she said. If they're moving survey markers, that's tampering with legal property lines. You could press charges. I'll file a notice of trespass and demand that the county assessor confirm your boundary." The words gave Mia a fleeting sense of control, but deep down, she knew that each escalation brought more risk. The more she fought, the angrier they'd become. The county surveyor came 3 days later, a quiet man in reflective gear who worked methodically under the gray sky. Mia watched him as he planted his instruments, adjusted his tripod, and muttered coordinates into his recorder. When he finally handed her the printed verification, she felt a rush of vindication so strong it made her dizzy. "You were right," he said simply. "Your land ends here." He pointed to a spot marked by the old iron stake that had been buried for decades. "They've been encroaching by about 20 feet. His words were calm, almost apologetic, but to Mia they sounded like revelation. That evening she stood at that very point, staring at the invisible line that had caused so much chaos. The forest was quiet, the sky bleeding into dusk. She wanted to feel triumphant, but all she felt was exhaustion. Winning one battle didn't stop the war. She knew John West wouldn't accept defeat quietly. The man thrived on control, and people like him didn't back down. They doubled down. Sure enough, the next day she received an envelope with the HOA's emblem stamped across the front. Inside was a notice claiming her unauthorized activity had created a safety concern for neighboring residents. The letter accused her of violating unspecified community codes and demanded immediate compliance. There was no explanation of what compliance meant, no citation of law, only vague intimidation. At the bottom, beneath the signature, was a handwritten line that made her blood boil. "Consider selling before matters get complicated." She drove straight to Laura's office, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The lawyer read the letter twice, her expression unreadable. "This isn't just harassment anymore," she said. "It's coercion. They're trying to force you into surrendering your property." She picked up the phone and began dialing. "We're filing a cease and desist today." That night, as rain drummed softly against the windows, Mia sat by the fire with her dog at her feet, staring into the flickering orange light. The house that had once felt like a haven now felt like a fortress under siege. She thought about her uncle, how fiercely independent he'd been, how he'd once told her that land meant freedom only if you had the courage to defend it. She understood him now in a way she never had before. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside reminded her that freedom always came at a price. As the clock struck midnight, her phone buzzed with a notification from the new security camera. A motion alert. She opened the app, her breath catching in her throat. The footage showed the faint glow of headlights stopping at the edge of her property, then a figure stepping out, shining a flashlight along the fence before disappearing into the dark. The timestamp read 12:07 a.m. The figure never crossed the line this time, but it didn't have to. The message was clear. They were still watching. They wanted her afraid, exhausted, and compliant. But as she sat there in the dim firelight, her fear began to harden into something else, something colder and sharper. She would not break. Not for them. Not for anyone. The storm that swept through the county that week left the neighborhood drenched and silent, branches strewn across driveways and mud spilling over curbs. For Mia, it also brought a kind of uneasy stillness, as though even the forces that had been tormenting her needed to catch their breath. She used those few days of quiet to focus on gathering every shred of proof she could find: recordings, letters, inspection notices, timestamps from her security cameras. The footage of the midnight visitor had been grainy, but distinct enough to show a figure in a hooded raincoat. Laura had warned her that in disputes like these, solid evidence was the only armor that mattered. So Mia built her armor piece by piece, every page a small victory against the chaos. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that each step toward truth also brought her closer to danger. It was as though exposing the lies that surrounded her property might summon something worse than harassment, something personal. The day of the county hearing arrived sooner than she expected. Laura had arranged for them to meet with a zoning officer and an assessor to confirm once and for all that the HOA had no authority over Mia's land. Mia dressed carefully, not for appearances, but to steady her nerves. A dark green blouse, her uncle's old silver bracelet, the one he had said would bring her luck. As they sat in the sterile office, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed deafening. Across the table sat a representative from the HOA's legal counsel, a man with thinning hair and a rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Alden and spoke with the bland courtesy of someone accustomed to bending truth into formality. He began with practiced composure, claiming that the HOA's boundary maps had been updated as part of a recent land use revision and that her property fell within the revised jurisdiction. Laura's expression remained calm, but her eyes flashed cold anger. She slid across the official county map from 2017, then another from 2020, both of which clearly excluded Mia's parcel. The assessor compared them carefully, his brow furrowing. When he finally spoke, his tone carried quiet finality. Ms. Langley's property is not and has never been under HOA jurisdiction. Any enforcement or complaint actions filed against her were invalid. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alden's polite mask faltered for a split second before he nodded stiffly and began collecting his papers. "We'll review this internally," he muttered, but everyone in the room knew it was over. Driving home that afternoon, Mia felt something close to relief for the first time in months. She rolled down the window and let the wind whip through her hair, the scent of wet pine drifting in from the forest. The fight wasn't over, she knew that, but it felt as though she had finally gained a foothold. The law was on her side. The logic was on her side. All she had to do now was hold her ground. When she reached her driveway, she stopped for a moment before pulling in. The house looked different, stronger somehow, its weathered siding glowing softly in the late sunlight. For a moment, she believed she might finally be safe. That illusion lasted exactly 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd, she found her back gate wide open and deep footprints leading toward the half-finished studio foundation. Her stomach twisted as she followed the trail. The ground had been disturbed, the stakes uprooted again, and one of her survey flags lay half-buried in the mud, snapped clean in two. Near the fence, she saw something small and glinting, a brass button, the kind from a uniform jacket. She picked it up carefully, wiping the dirt away with her sleeve. The initials engraved on it, J.W., made her heart pound. It was almost too direct, too theatrical to be coincidence. Laura filed a formal trespassing complaint that afternoon, attaching photographs and a copy of the county's ruling as evidence. But the deputy who took the statement seemed hesitant. "I can file the report," he said slowly. "But you should know these HOA disputes tend to get messy. Folks on their board have friends in the county office. Things take time." Mia wanted to scream. Time was exactly what they wanted, to stretch her patience until she gave up. That evening, she called her mother for the first time in weeks. She tried to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Her mother listened quietly, offering the same gentle advice she always did: to stay calm, to document, to trust the process. But when Mia hung up, she sat in silence, staring at the reflection of the porch lights in her wine glass. The process was broken, and everyone knew it. Justice only worked for people who could afford to wait forever. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of gravel crunching outside. Peering through the window, she saw a white pickup parked by the road and 3 men unloading equipment: tripods, measuring rods, and a rolled blueprint. One of them wore a jacket with an HOA emblem stitched across the chest. Mia stormed outside, her pulse hammering in her ears. "You're trespassing!" she shouted, her voice sharper than she expected. The oldest man turned toward her, his tone smooth and detached. "We're conducting a boundary reassessment for the community," he said. "You've been notified." "No, I haven't," she snapped, brandishing the county ruling she kept folded in her back pocket. "You have no authority here. Leave now." For a moment, none of them moved. Then the man gave a small, condescending smile. "Boundaries can change," he said, "especially when people don't cooperate." They packed their equipment slowly, deliberately, each movement a display of disdain. Before leaving, one of them muttered under his breath, "You'll wish you'd just sold." That night, Mia reviewed her camera footage again. The pickup truck had arrived at 7:43 a.m. and left at 8:12. 30 minutes after their departure, a second car appeared, a black sedan that stopped briefly near the gate before turning around. The camera caught only a fragment of its license plate, but it was enough for Laura to trace it back to a private contractor employed by the HOA's legal firm. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was surveillance. Over the next few days, Mia felt the change in atmosphere like a shift in pressure before a storm. The harassment grew subtler but heavier. Anonymous letters slipped under her door accused her of endangering neighborhood safety. Her business website was flooded with one-star reviews from accounts that had been created only hours apart. The isolation that had once comforted her now felt suffocating. Even her dog, Luna, grew restless, pacing by the windows and growling at shadows. Then came the confrontation. She was returning from the grocery store when she saw John West standing by her gate, talking to one of the neighbors. When he spotted her car, he smiled. A politician's smile, polished and empty. She parked and stepped out, every muscle in her body tense. "Good afternoon, Ms. Langley," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "I wanted to extend an olive branch. Perhaps we can resolve this amicably. The association has concerns about the visual impact of your studio project. It's disruptive to the aesthetic of the community." Mia stared at him, incredulous. "I'm not part of your community," she said flatly. His smile didn't waver. "That's a matter of interpretation." The conversation stretched on, each of his words laced with veiled threats wrapped in civility. He warned her about civil penalties, about loss of property value, about potential liens. She didn't interrupt. She just let him talk, her anger simmering quietly beneath the surface until finally she said, "You don't scare me." The moment the words left her mouth, she saw it, the flicker of something dark in his eyes, a cold, measured rage he couldn't quite hide. "You should be careful what battles you choose," he said softly before walking away. That night, the storm returned, hammering rain against the windows and rattling the roof. The power flickered twice before going out completely. In the dark, Mia sat on the floor of her studio foundation under a tarp, clutching a flashlight, listening to the wind whip through the trees. She should have been terrified, but instead she felt something unfamiliar. Clarity. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The HOA had overplayed its hand, and John West had finally shown his true face. They thought she was just one woman alone, easy to corner, easy to silence. They didn't realize that she had already turned fear into fuel. The war they started was about to change sides. The following week unfolded like a series of traps laid in plain sight. It began with the letter taped to Mia's front door, an official-looking document stamped with a county seal, printed on heavy paper that felt deliberate in its attempt to appear authentic. At first glance, it seemed to be an order to cease and desist all construction pending review of safety compliance. For a few seconds, Mia felt her stomach drop, her breath catching in her throat as she reread the words. But the longer she stared at the letter, the more irregularities she noticed. The font slightly off, the spacing uneven, the signature blurred like it had been scanned from somewhere else. She took a picture and sent it to Laura, who called her back within minutes, her voice sharp with controlled fury. "That's a forgery," she said. "They didn't even bother to get the right department header. Do not respond to it. Do not remove it until I can send someone to collect it. This is now a criminal matter." Mia stood on her porch, the wind tugging at her hair, and felt something twist inside her. Not fear this time, but disgust. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were trying to create a paper trail to legitimize their lies. Within hours, Laura had filed a complaint with the sheriff's office and the county clerk. Yet the process felt slow, too slow for the kind of pressure Mia was under. The next day, another envelope appeared in her mailbox, this one bearing the HOA logo once again. It accused her of interfering with community operations and harassing board members. The accusations bordered on absurdity, but what struck her most was the inclusion of photographs, grainy, long-distance shots of her working in her garden, talking to the surveyor, even walking her dog along the property line. Someone had been following her for weeks, documenting her every move. She could almost feel the phantom presence of the lens on her skin, the sense of being watched sinking deeper into her bones. That night, sleep was impossible. She sat by the window, the glow from her laptop screen painting her face pale blue as she scrolled through property law articles, HOA case studies, anything that could help her understand the mechanism being used against her. There was a pattern to it, she realized. The association thrived on exhaustion, drowning opponents in paperwork, fear, and reputation damage until they broke. But she also began to uncover a history of similar disputes, different towns, different names, but the same tactics, fabricated notices, selective law enforcement, and pressure to sell. Her case wasn't unique, it was part of a strategy. The realization made her both sick and strangely resolute. 2 days later, as she returned home from town, she saw 2 county vehicles parked near her gate. A code officer and a building inspector were standing by the fence, talking in low voices. When she approached, they turned toward her with forced politeness. "We received a complaint about unauthorized wiring on a secondary structure," one of them said, gesturing vaguely toward the direction of her unfinished studio. "We'll just need to take a quick look." Mia laughed bitterly, her voice trembling with anger. "That's interesting," she said, "because I don't even have electricity running there yet. But go ahead. Look all you want. You'll find nothing but mud." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly aware they'd been sent on a fool's errand. After a cursory inspection, they apologized, muttering about miscommunication and clerical errors. But when they left, she saw John West standing in his driveway across the road, pretending to check his mail. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time she didn't look away. Later that night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, she heard a faint mechanical hum outside, a sound too rhythmic to be the wind. She stepped onto the porch and saw a drone hovering above the tree line, its red light blinking steadily as it glided over her yard. For a moment she stood frozen, every instinct screaming that this was no coincidence. Then, without thinking, she raised her phone and filmed it, tracking its slow orbit until it disappeared into the darkness beyond the pines. When she showed the footage to Laura, her lawyer sighed. "It's not illegal for them to fly over open airspace," she said, "but it's harassment all the same. Keep the video. We can use it to show a pattern of intimidation." The next morning, Mia found the remnants of her mailbox scattered across the gravel. The pole snapped in two, the box itself crushed as if someone had struck it with a hammer. The flag lay several feet away, bent nearly flat. She photographed everything, uploaded the images to a secure drive, and called the sheriff again. The deputy who arrived this time was younger, more attentive, and visibly disturbed by what he saw. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "whoever's doing this doesn't want to scare you. They want to provoke you into reacting. They want you angry enough to make a mistake." His words struck her like a warning wrapped in empathy. "Then they picked the wrong person," she replied. That day marked a shift in her resolve. She stopped trying to explain herself, stopped apologizing, stopped hoping the harassment would end if she simply behaved rationally. Rationality had no place in this war. She doubled down, hired a private investigator to track license plates near her gate, upgraded her cameras to include night vision, and installed motion-triggered lights that flooded the yard in white glare at the slightest movement. The first night they activated, She caught sight of a figure retreating into the trees, illuminated just long enough for her to see the pale flash of a face turning away. The following week, Laura called with news that the forged cease and desist notice had been traced to a printer registered to the HOA office. It was enough for the sheriff's department to open a formal investigation, though Laura warned her not to expect swift justice. "These things move slowly," she said, "but they've crossed a line. It's not a civil issue anymore. It's criminal." The words brought a grim satisfaction, but Mia knew better than to celebrate. Retaliation was inevitable. Her intuition proved correct. 2 nights later, someone cut the power to her house. She woke to the sound of Luna barking furiously and the smell of smoke. Not fire, but burnt insulation from the severed line near the meter. The sheriff's department responded within the hour, but the damage was already done. No suspects, no fingerprints, just another warning carved into the silence. As she stood outside in the dark, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand, she felt something break inside her, a boundary deeper than the physical one they'd been trying to move. They had taken her sense of safety, but they hadn't taken her fight. The next morning, she called a meeting with Laura and the investigator. Together they built a case file thicker than a novel. Maps, videos, timestamps, statements, forged letters, trespassing photos, surveillance records. "They've made themselves sloppy," the investigator said. "Too many moving parts, too many witnesses. You've got them cornered if you push this to court." Mia nodded slowly. Her hands were steady now, her voice calm. The fear that had once hollowed her out was gone, replaced by something solid and unyielding. "Then let's push," she said. As the day faded into evening, she sat on her porch watching the road, waiting for the inevitable next move. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and somewhere in the distance a storm was building again. She thought about her uncle's old words, the ones she'd almost forgotten. "Land doesn't make you free unless you're willing to defend it." Now she understood what he had meant. They could destroy her mailbox, stalk her property, even try to rewrite the law, but they couldn't take away the truth. The line they'd crossed wasn't just marked by stakes or fences, it was carved into her will, and that was something they could never move. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, the kind of day that began with low clouds pressing against the horizon and a stillness that felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Mia had barely slept the night before, pacing the living room while the clock ticked relentlessly forward. The case had grown beyond a neighborhood feud. It was now a matter of law, trespass, and forgery, the kind of scandal that small-town newspapers whispered about but rarely understood. As she sat in the courtroom beside Laura, her lawyer, she felt the full weight of months of fear, humiliation, and defiance pressing against her chest. Across the aisle sat John West, immaculately dressed, his expression smooth and indifferent, like a man certain that charm and influence could wash away any wrongdoing. His attorney spoke in low tones, smiling at the judge with the confidence of someone used to bending rooms to his will. But as the session began, it was clear that this time the rules had changed. Laura's presentation was methodical and devastating. She began with the official county maps, tracing the property line with a red marker as she spoke, her tone calm but edged with precision. "The Langley property," she said, "has never fallen within the Homeowners Association's jurisdiction. Yet for over 3 months, my client has been subjected to repeated harassment, false claims, and acts of intimidation designed to pressure her into surrendering her land. Each piece of evidence followed like a blade. The 12 inspection reports, each dismissed without findings. The grainy photographs of her taken without consent. The forged cease and desist notice traced back to an HOA printer. Then came the surveillance footage, the drone hovering over her garden, the men on her property at midnight, the power line cut. Each clip played in silence except for the faint hum of the projector, the evidence filling the courtroom with an unease so thick it felt physical. When Laura called the county surveyor to the stand, his testimony left no room for argument. "The property boundary has remained unchanged since 1984, he said. The markers that were moved were placed there illegally. Whoever installed them was trespassing. John West's lawyer tried to pivot, arguing that any misunderstandings were clerical in nature, that no harm had been done, that Mia's hostile reaction had escalated matters unnecessarily. But the judge interrupted him, his tone flat and unimpressed. "Forging a legal notice is not a clerical error," he said, "and intimidation is not administrative miscommunication." The turning point came when the private investigator took the stand. Calm and composed, he described tracing the drone's registration number back to a subcontractor hired by the HOA. The courtroom murmured, a ripple of disbelief passing through the spectators. Laura leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "So, the HOA board, under the authority of Mr. John West, directly employed surveillance tactics against a private citizen outside of their jurisdiction?" The investigator nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They did." When John was finally called to testify, the polished veneer he'd worn for months began to crack. He tried to maintain composure, speaking about community standards and miscommunication, but Laura's cross-examination sliced through every pretense. She presented the brass button with his initials, the one found near Mia's fence, and asked simply, "Was this yours?" For a moment, he said nothing. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicked toward his attorney, and that single hesitation was enough. The judge noticed it. Everyone noticed it. Laura didn't need to push further. The silence was an admission. When it was over, the judge's verdict was clear and merciless. The HOA was found guilty of multiple violations: trespassing, harassment, falsification of documents, and ordered to pay full restitution and legal costs. The forgery and surveillance charges were referred to the district attorney for criminal review. John West was stripped of his position as HOA president effective immediately, pending further investigation. The gavel struck once, the sound echoing through the room like the closing of a heavy door. Mia sat still for a long moment after the judge left the bench, her body trembling not with fear, but with the shock of release. It felt unreal, the sudden silence after months of noise and tension, as though she'd stepped out of a storm into air too calm to trust. Laura touched her arm gently, a small nod of reassurance. "You did it," she said. "They can't touch you now." But Mia wasn't so sure. She'd won on paper, yes, but she knew that people like John rarely disappeared quietly. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and bright. Reporters lingered on the steps, cameras ready, their questions sharp and eager. Mia ignored them, walking past without a word. She didn't need headlines. She needed peace. Yet even as she drove home, a part of her stayed alert, scanning every car in her rearview mirror, every face she didn't recognize. The victory felt fragile, like glass still cooling after being pulled from the fire. When she reached her driveway, she stopped and looked at the gate, the same gate that had once been a symbol of division, and now stood like a monument to endurance. The house beyond it was quiet, wrapped in the golden light of late afternoon. She opened the door and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing softly through the empty rooms. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the last of the storm clouds drift away. But as the sun began to set, she noticed something in the dirt near the fence, a small white envelope pinned beneath a stone. Her heart gave a faint, tired flutter. She walked outside, the gravel crunching under her shoes, and picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one line written in elegant handwriting. "This isn't over." Mia stared at the words, the evening wind tugging at her hair. For a moment she felt the old fear stir again, cold and familiar. Then she folded the paper, slid it into her pocket, and turned back toward the house. The message didn't change the outcome. It only confirmed what she already knew. Peace wasn't something granted. It was something defended. And she was ready to defend it, no matter who tried to take it away again. The weeks that followed the hearing passed like a slow exhale after months of suffocating tension. The air around the neighborhood seemed lighter, quieter, though an undercurrent of unease still drifted beneath the calm. John West's resignation from the HOA board became the subject of gossip whispered over fences and at mailboxes. Some neighbors pretended they had never supported him. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The association, desperate to repair its image, issued a formal apology to Mia, carefully worded, polished, and hollow. She read it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer. Words, she had learned, meant nothing without accountability. The real victory was not the apology or even the compensation check that arrived later, but the silence that finally settled around her home. The first night she slept with the windows open again, the sound of the wind moving through the pines felt almost unreal. Luna curled beside her bed, sighing softly in her sleep, and for the first time in months, Mia dreamed without interruption. When she awoke, the morning light cut through the blinds in long golden stripes, and the house smelled faintly of cedar and paint. She spent the day restoring what had been lost to fear, replanting the garden beds, repainting the mailbox, rebuilding the sense of ownership that had been chipped away by months of intimidation. The studio, now nearly finished, stood as both her workspace and her defiance made solid, a place born from conflict, but shaped by perseverance. Each brushstroke on its walls felt like a reclamation, a quiet declaration that she had survived their attempt to erase her. Sometimes, while tending to her plants, she caught glimpses of the road beyond the trees, expecting to see a drone or a car idling where it didn't belong. But nothing came. The cameras remained in place. The motion lights still glowed at night, and though part of her missed the feeling of complete vulnerability that once defined her solitude, she accepted that vigilance was now part of her peace. It wasn't paranoia, it was wisdom. A few weeks later, the new HOA president, a woman named Karen Lewis, came by unannounced, holding a bouquet of lilies and a document folder. Her tone was measured and apologetic, as she explained that the board intended to review every policy to ensure such abuses never happened again. Mia listened politely, her hands folded, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. She didn't trust promises, not anymore, but she respected the effort. When Karen left, Mia placed the flowers on her porch table and watched them sway in the wind. The petals trembled, but did not fall. As evening settled in, she walked down to the edge of her property, where the old iron stake marked the boundary. She brushed the dirt from its surface and ran her fingers over the cold metal, the line between her world and theirs. Beyond it lay rules, regulations, and the machinery of power that had nearly consumed her. On her side was the quiet pulse of freedom. She stayed there for a while, listening to the forest breathe, the sound of crickets rising like a fragile song against the fading light. When she turned back toward the house, the windows glowed with warm light, and the faint outline of her studio stood steady against the darkening sky. She thought about everything she had endured, the forged letters, the fear, the endless visits, and realized that in some strange way, they had given her more than they had taken. She had learned the shape of her own strength, the weight of standing alone and refusing to yield. The land had tested her. The people around her had tried to break her, but the boundary had held, not because of the stake or the documents, but because she had chosen to hold it. And as she walked up the path toward her porch, the first stars beginning to pierce the twilight, she understood that peace was not a gift the world offered. It was something she had built, one battle at a time, and it was hers to keep.